So this car is making a horrendous screaming noise from the front end. And it's this thing right here. Yeah, I should not be able to move it that much. Yeah, that's bad. I should fix that. And I've got a new pulley, so I am going to fix it. But not in this video. No. This video is part 2 of my 2007 Honda Civic Si build. In the last video, we pulled the engine out, tore down the K24 donor engine as well. And in this part 2 video, we're actually going to start building the engine. This car will end up in some future videos eventually. But for now, let's get back to the Civic. Alright, let's kick this off by talking about my debilitating addiction to buying car parts. When you start a project like this, you're going to want to set up a spreadsheet that has all the parts you're going to buy, where you're going to source them from, and how much they're going to cost. This will give you an idea of what you can reasonably do in this project. As you can see, I spent about $3,700 on this, on top of the $3,000 car that I bought. Here are the big ticket items that I bought. Wiseco forged pistons, Manley forged connecting rods, Skunk 2 Stage 3 camshaft, Skunk 2 valve springs, and a set of stainless steel long tube headers to top it all off. Now, before I can put any of those expensive parts into the engine, the block needs some prep work. It needs to be cleaned, the cylinder bores need to be rehoned. So you see we're spraying them down with WD-40, and then we're using a cylinder hone to clean up the inside of the bores. You'll notice I'm not using one of those dingle ball hone things. I've never understood those ball hone ones. This style with the flat stones I think is much better. So I'm kind of showing these steps a little bit out of order. What you really want to do before you buy anything is measure everything. Measuring the cylinders will tell you if the block is good or if you need to have it bored out and run larger diameter pistons. I was able to find a service manual online for the K24 and K20 engines, so I was able to get the exact specs. And I think that when I measured it, it came out to be either just a hair within spec or a hair outside of spec, but I was not going to take this to a machine shop. I didn't have the time or the money to have that happen. You could take the block to a machine shop to have them measure it, or you could buy a bore gauge and a set of micrometers to measure it yourself, and that's what I ended up doing. Now that the block has been deemed more or less acceptable, it can move on to the rings, pistons, and connecting rods. That's the factory K24 on the right, and the ones I'm going to put in are the ones on the left. So when it comes to these components, before you assemble anything, you want to weigh everything. Weigh them all separately, weigh them all combined. You're trying to put together combinations of parts that weigh about the same, or as close to the same as possible. Maybe within half a gram or a quarter of a gram or something. This is to make sure that your rotating assembly is balanced. And it's not going to vibrate itself to pieces. So as you can see, I'm going through and weighing every piece individually. I'm laying them out, then I'm weighing all the pistons, I'm weighing individually, weighing all the ring packs individually, the wrist pins, connecting rods, all of them individually, and then I'm trying to add them all up and put them into bins so that all the different combined weights are the same. Yeah, this is a lot of work and it's tedious, but this is how you make a good engine. And once you're done weighing everything, you should measure your pistons again just to verify that you have the correct piston-to-wall clearance. Alright, it's time to address the rings, which is going to involve more measuring. You need to set the ring gap correctly on your piston rings. If the gap is too loose, you might have more blow-by and lose compression when you're running the engine. If it's too tight, then the rings might bind up when they heat up when the engine is running. And that could cause catastrophic damage. When you buy piston rings, they should come with a information card from the supplier that tells you what ring gap to run for your application, whether it's naturally aspirated, boosted, whatever. They should also tell you how how to orient the rings and the pistons correctly. Did you think you were done measuring? Well, because you're not, but don't worry, it's okay. It's almost over. It's only a couple of things we got to measure. Next thing you got to measure, though, is the crank and rod bearings. This starts with looking up a code on the side of the engine block and on the crankshaft and using those two codes and this lookup table to figure out which color-coded bearings you need to buy from Honda. In my case, I had to buy yellow and pink for the 5 different crank journals. Whenever you're installing bearings, make sure that the bearing itself and the journal surface are both clean. You don't want there to be any oil on there. Also, make sure you put them on the correct side. There is a top and bottom bearing. With the bearings in place, we can drop the crankshaft in because we need to do some measuring. This is plastic gauge. And the way it works is that inside that paper tube there is a thin strand of this putty-like material. And what you do is you take that little strand, you lay it across the bearing surface, and then you clamp the two sides together. This works for both the crank and the rod bearings. You torque it all down, and this smushes that strand and flattens it out. And then you take the pieces off, and then you measure that smush to determine what your bearing clearance is. If it's too much or not enough, you might need to order different size bearings. There's a similar process for the connecting rod bearings too. Again, you look at the crankshaft to find the right code, which you use in this lookup table to determine what bearings you need to order. These are the bearings I ended up ordering. Oh hey, look at that, we're out of the basement and back in the garage. That means we're done measuring and it's actually finally time to start assembling stuff. We've got the main bearings dropped in, Randy's putting in the thrust bearings. We put assembly lube on the crank bearings and now we're dropping the crankshaft in. You want to be careful that you don't knock out or damage any of the bearings, or scratch up the surfaces. Now it's time to seal it all up with Honda Bond, Honda's proprietary RTV. This stuff's pretty good. If you start a project like this, you should grab a tube or two of it. Now we can drop the main cap girdle into place, put in all the bolts, and torque it down. The torque specs on these bolts is 22 foot-pounds plus an additional 56-degree turn. And there is a pattern that you have to follow. Make sure everything still spins after you tighten it all down. Here's the torque sequence for the main caps. Then you can drop in the side bolts and torque them down as well. And there's a pattern for them as well. Time for the rods and pistons. First, flip the block over, lube up the cylinder bores. Then we assemble the pistons. First, the wrist pin goes into the piston. Then the connecting rod. Then the wrist pin gets pushed all the way through. Then the retaining clips go in place. And we do that 3 more times. I bought a ring compressor that matches the diameter of the cylinder bore, so this makes it really easy for putting the pistons in. I don't have to use one of those ones that cranks down to compress the rings. Just be careful when you're doing this so you're not binding up the rings or damaging the bearing surfaces. These rods came with ARP bolts and instructions on how to tighten the ARP bolts down. There's some specific way to tighten ARP bolts. It's not the same as factory connecting rod bolts. That's beautiful. This next part is optional. You could use the factory oil pump from the K24, but I chose to go with the oil pump from the Acura RSX. This gets rid of the balance shafts that are normally built into the K20 and K24 oil pumps, so that's less losses on the engine, and it frees up more room for more oil in the oil pan. Downside is that this is going to make your engine rattle more, because those balance shafts take out some of the vibrations from the engine. But whatever, this is project car, so I don't really care. To pull this off, you're going to need the RSX windage tray and the chain and tensioner and guide for the RSX oil pump. Now, this is not a quick bolt-in thing you can do. You have to make some modifications. First, on the main girdle, There are these raised portions for the K24. Those aren't present on the older K20 that the RSX engine had. So, to get around this, you have to shave down part of the casting of the oil pump. I think we ended up removing that entire rib that runs along the bottom of the RSX oil pump. Once you get rid of that, then you'll have the clearance you need. The other modification you need to make is this oil jet on the bottom of the crank girdle. You need to pull this out. I think we used a screw to pull it out, and then you need to plug that hole. I believe that hole is already threaded, so you should be able to find a bolt to run in there to seal it up. I think we filled up the hole with RTV and then ran a bolt in there. With the bottom end pretty much all tied up now, we can work on the cylinder head. You'll notice we moved back to the basement where it's more comfortable. I don't remember this clip. What am I doing in this clip? Oh, I'm cleaning it. Okay, yeah, I need to get all the old gasket material off. I want a nice, clean surface, and I don't want to get any scratches in the surface. Oh, I'm cleaning the ports too, yes. Make it all clean. Okay, enough of the funny business. So, what I'm actually doing here is I'm doing what's called valve lapping. If you're not familiar with valve lapping, what you do is you take a valve, you put this gritty compound on it, and then you rub the valve against the seat. And you're trying to grind the valve so that it seals against the seat as best as it can. And I want this engine to seal. I want to get as much out of it as I can. It's a slow process. I'm not going to bore you with the hours I spent working on this. We'll skip ahead to after I'm done with all the valve grinding stuff and doing something else that's more interesting. And we're back. So here I am dropping in the new valve spring seats and then the new valve stem seals on top of those seats. This is a tool for driving the seals onto the guide. Now the valves can go back into place. I made sure to keep track of where each valve came from, so I made sure they all went back to the same spot they came out of. With the valves in place, now I can install the springs, the retainers, and the keepers in there. I bought this valve compressor tool made for Honda K-Series cylinder heads, and it made this process go a lot faster. It's so nice seeing all this stuff come together. All the months of planning and buying parts. It's very satisfying to see the results. Alright, back out into the garage where it's time to install the cylinder head in the block. We're running the ARP studs all the way in just by hand. That's part of the instructions when you order ARP head studs, they have instructions, of course. And they tell you about, run them all the way in by hand, snug them down, put the cylinder head on. And then they'll have more instructions on what to do with the washers and the nuts and the assembly lube and how you're supposed to torque the ARP head studs down. I think it was different than the factory head bolts. Again, just be sure to follow the ARP instructions for tightening these down. I think it was in steps, we were around one time and then we went again. And be sure to follow the torque sequence. Ta-da!
Right.
Yep.
Sweet.
There's a head. With the head in place, now we can start bolting on all the valve train components. One other thing that I'm going to skip over is that I spent a lot of time tearing apart, cleaning, lubing up, and reassembling the VTEC components. I don't know if this is really a necessary step. I don't remember finding any surprises there, so well, whatever. It's peace of mind anyway. Before assembling all the valve train stuff, we spun the engine around so that the cylinders were all halfway in the bores. This way, when we tighten down the cams, we're not going to press a valve into a piston. That would be bad. And finally, I can drop in the camshafts. These are the last of the really expensive engine parts. That's $740 of metal rod that I'm holding in my hands. Make sure you're using like assembly lube on this stuff when you're doing a rebuild. You don't want to destroy all this stuff when you first fire up your engine. Also, when you're tearing this thing apart, make sure you have a way to keep track of where all the cam caps and all the bolts go. Oh yeah, so before you bolt in the cams, you should reattach these plates to the back of the camshafts. These are for the cam position sensors. So we forgot to bolt these back on before bolting down the cams. Now, if you do that, you can squeeze them in behind that last cam cap, but you have to shave down part of it, and I don't recommend it. Just attach these before you bolt the cams in. Now we can bolt on the exhaust sprocket and the intake VCT phaser sprocket. Now that the cams are installed, we need to line them up so that we can get the timing correct. The goal is to get the two timing marks on the cam sprockets to line up and the other two marks to point up to the top. Then you want to lock the cams in place with this cam retaining tool. These slide into the cam position plates on the back of the cams. This can be a little tricky to do because at this point the cams are under spring pressure, so they'll want to snap around, especially the intake one because that has the VCT, and that can let the intake cam suddenly snap another 30 or 60 degrees over. Now we can rotate the crank to bring cylinder 1 up to top dead center. You'll only reach this point when the timing mark on the crank sprocket matches the timing mark on the engine block. Now we can install the guides for the timing chain. Now we can lay the timing chain on top of all the sprockets. There are 3 colored links in the chain that need to match up with the 3 timing marks. And finally, we can install the timing chain tensioner and pull the pin.
Make sure you do not lose.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. Pull this out.
We also added an aftermarket lower guide for the timing chain. This is supposed to keep the chain on the sprocket when the engine is running at high RPM. Does it work? I don't know, but it looks cool. We installed the upper guide and then turned it over a couple times to make sure that nothing was going to bind up and the valves weren't going to hit pistons. There are plenty of other videos of people setting the valve lash on these engines, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on it. I will say, though, that doing this while the engine was outside of the car was great. We could just walk around the engine and get to every valve easily. It's still a lot of work and a long, slow task, but doing it outside the car was awesome. looks so much better than those factory stamped ones. So I wanted to reuse the factory K20 oil cooler, which isn't quite a direct bolt-in because the K24 and the K20 have some different fittings and different castings. The place where one of the fittings goes on the K20 is blocked off on the K24. So to make this work, I have to pull out this coolant drain plug from the side of the block. This is also where like a block heater would mount if you had one of these installed. Then I have to buy this fitting from Honda, which is also apparently used on the S2000. So I have an S2000 part in this car. Cool. It goes in that place where the block heater plug thing would go. And that allows me to attach the hoses from the K20 oil cooler. I also have to reuse the filter cooler bolt, the thing that the filter bolts onto that goes through the oil cooler from the K20. I have to reuse that here as well. Oh yeah, and the other piece of this is that you need to get the Civic Si water pump. It's almost the same as the K24 water pump, but it has a place for you to put the fitting that the other cooling hose attaches to. And you may need to swap that fitting from your old water pump onto this new one. I don't remember if the new one came with the fitting. Oh great, now I get to put this back on. This was fun to take off. Honda recommends that you lube up the bolt on this. I went ahead and also got a new bolt for this. I think they recommend you get a new bolt also. Torque on this actually isn't that extreme. It's only 36 foot-pounds. Then you turn it 90 degrees, make paint marks on the head of the bolt and on the balancer to help you know how far you're turning it. And don't forget to put the Woodruff key back in. Alright, yeah, this is a pretty important piece of this. So, to make this engine fit correctly inside the Civic, I have to use this Honda CR-V passenger side bracket. This is for the passenger side motor mount. I can't reuse the one that bolted onto the front cover of the K20 engine. It won't place the engine in the right spot, so I have to get this one to make it work. Now I can start putting all the accessories back on the engine. I like how Honda put them all on the front side of the engine. It's nice and easy to get to. I don't like it when car companies put like half the accessories on the front side and half on the back side where you can never get to them. Oh yeah, it's all coming together. Alright, here's another optional step in this. So, the Civic has this thing called a thermal bypass valve that touches the coolant and allows the coolant to warm up air that can then go into this pocket between the intake manifold and the cylinder head. Like, the air doesn't go inside either the intake manifold or the cylinder head. I'm guessing it's just to help warm up the air for cold starting. I'm not sure, but what you can do is plug it off, and that's what I did. I capped off the one end, and then I put a plug into the coolant side. I love the way these PLM headers look, and I love that they come in multiple pieces. This allowed us to bolt up the flange while the engine was still outside of the car. This probably would not have been easy to do once the engine was inside the car. If it was one piece, it probably wouldn't even fit in the car anyway. We had to do some clearancing with a hammer and hit the firewall and some of the runners a little bit to get them to fit right. The only issue we had here is that the flange on the PLM headers is thicker than the flange on the factory manifold, so we had to get some longer bolts, but that wasn't a problem. I'm gonna be honest, until seeing this footage, I had completely forgotten that we actually replaced the pilot bushing too.
I do not remember doing this. It's an important step, though. Also, I do remember we put the main seal in. Obviously I'm not going to assemble an engine without replacing the rear main seal. The flywheel I got for this was a lightweight aluminum Fidanza flywheel. This is the kind that has the replaceable friction surface in it, which was great because I got a good deal on this on Facebook Marketplace. And all I had to do was spend like $50 to buy the replacement friction surface. So this was a really good find. I went with our replacement XZD clutch. This is the one that everyone online suggests to get for these cars. I'm probably not going to be making enough horsepower to justify some other higher end kind of clutch. This one should be fine. And in the times I've driven it, I haven't noticed any like clutch slip. So it works. One note on the pressure plate bolts. I believe the spec is 19 foot-pounds, but I think a lot of people recommend using either thread locker or going up to like 22 or 25 foot-pounds. Otherwise, they might back out. Yeah, I know. I painted the valve covers wrinkle red. Everyone paints the valve covers wrinkle red. It's not original, but it looks so good on these Honda engines. Anyway, we got everything put back together. All the wiring, all the hoses for all the cooling stuff. Vacuum lines for some of the other stuff that's on here. We went ahead and remounted the transmission, which was easier to do outside the car, but it is still a pain to line up the input shaft and the dowel pins. It's not easy on these. Honda used several different sizes of bolts on the transmission, so when you're taking it all apart, make sure you keep track of where all the bolts go. Also, this is a great time to replace the starter.
Shroud for it, so you don't need it.
I actually didn't get any footage of us putting the engine and transmission back in the car. 36 hours of footage I had to go through, and I didn't capture any of that, but I did get some pictures, so that's what I'm going to show you now. Something else to note is that when I put this back in here, I used stiffer front and rear motor mounts. This way the engine won't rock as much when it's running, and the reason I had to do that is because with the softer factory mounts, the headers would have swung up and hit the firewall. And this is because the K24 is a taller engine than the K20. So I needed stronger mounts to take the vibration out. Yes, it's recording. You can be in it if you want.
I didn't ask your permission.
Okay. We fixed the angry pulley on this car. So, you may have noticed that you just sat through a whole video of me building a Civic engine, and we didn't shoot any footage of us driving the Civic. That's because we did. We took it to a drag strip, and I destroyed second gear in it. So next video, you're going to see us take out the transmission and rebuild it. Again, we actually did it twice.
2 times.
Yes.
Actually, we did it 2 times in 2 different Civics, but we didn't record the black one because that was
long time
like
ago.
5 years ago, before this channel existed, really.
Yeah. All right. Well, that should be coming out next week. Thank everyone for watching.
See you next week.